Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. Can a marriage survive after one spouse destroys the other in public? Stay until the final scene, because the woman everyone expects to break will make one quiet decision that changes a family, a company, and a powerful man's understanding of love. The answer begins in the grand ballroom of the Astoria Grand Hotel, where a crystal chandelier scattered warm light across every polished wine glass. A string quartet played softly in the background, filling the room with the familiar melody Claire Donovan had chosen for her wedding 8 years earlier. It had once sounded like a promise. Tonight, it sounded like a farewell. Nearly 200 guests filled the ballroom. Business partners, investors, society reporters, friends who believed they were attending another flawless celebration hosted by one of New York's most admired power couples. No one noticed Claire's fingers trembling beneath the white tablecloth. Nearly 7 months pregnant, she sat gracefully beside her husband, one hand resting gently over the small life growing inside her. Every few seconds, the baby kicked as if sensing the strange silence buried beneath the laughter surrounding them. Across the room, cameras flashed. The media loved Ethan Whitmore, 36 years old, founder of Whitmore Capital, the self-made billionaire whose interviews inspired entrepreneurs across the country. They admired his confidence. They admired his discipline. They admired the perfect marriage he carefully displayed whenever a camera appeared. Only Claire knew how perfectly rehearsed that image had become. She remembered when Ethan used to look at her the way he now looked at quarterly earnings reports, with focus, excitement, hope. Somewhere along the years, she had become another obligation on his calendar. The violin faded. A waiter refilled the champagne glasses. Someone tapped a spoon against crystal. Ladies and gentlemen, applause spread across the ballroom as Ethan slowly stood. His tailored black tuxedo fit him flawlessly. His smile was calm, practiced, almost presidential. He lifted his champagne glass. Thank you all for celebrating our anniversary tonight. More applause. Claire forced herself to smile. She had spent the entire afternoon convincing herself that perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps he would remember who they used to be. Perhaps becoming a father would soften the walls he had built around himself. Perhaps. Ethan turned toward her. For a brief second, their eyes met. She searched for warmth. She found none. His voice remained steady. I've been thinking about something for a long time. The room grew quieter. Even the musicians lowered their bows. Ethan inhaled once. Then he smiled. Not at Claire, but at the crowd. I wish you weren't my wife. Silence. Absolute silence. The words landed harder than any slap. Some guests stared at Ethan. Others slowly turned toward Claire, unsure whether they had heard correctly. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand in the back of the ballroom. The sharp crack of breaking crystal echoed across the marble floor. Claire didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. Instead, she looked down at the diamond ring that had rested on her finger for 8 years. The same ring Ethan had placed there while promising forever beneath a summer sunset. She removed it. The tiny movement seemed louder than the shattered glass. She placed the ring beside her untouched champagne. Then she looked at Ethan with a calm expression he had not seen in years. There was no anger in her eyes. Only peace. That frightened him far more than tears ever could. Claire reached into her handbag. Not for tissues, not for makeup, for her phone. She unlocked it with steady fingers. One contact waited at the top of the screen. She pressed call. The line connected almost instantly. Claire spoke only 2 quiet words. It's time. She ended the call before anyone could ask a question. Around the ballroom, confused whispers spread like ripples across still water. Ethan frowned. For the first time that evening, something escaped his control, and he had no idea that, while every guest remained frozen inside the ballroom, events already unfolding beyond those gilded doors would soon dismantle the life he had spent years building, piece by carefully crafted piece. By the time those words are spoken aloud, the marriage has usually been dead for years. The ballroom remained suspended in a strange silence, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of a waiter nervously setting down a silver tray. Claire Donovan still sat perfectly straight. Her fingers rested over the gentle curve of her nearly 7-month pregnant belly, feeling the steady rhythm of tiny kicks beneath the ivory silk of her gown. Her baby was moving more than usual tonight, almost as if sensing the storm gathering around them. Across the table, Ethan Whitmore stared at her. He had expected tears, perhaps a desperate plea, maybe even anger, anything that would allow him to remain the composed victim of an emotional wife. Instead, Claire simply looked at him, calm, quiet, almost relieved. That expression unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said, forcing another polished smile, "I'm afraid my wife is emotional because of the pregnancy." A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room. Some guests looked away. Others lowered their glasses. No one wanted to become part of a billionaire's family drama. Claire heard every word. Pregnancy, hormones, emotional, the familiar explanations. The same excuses Ethan had repeated for nearly 2 years whenever she questioned another canceled dinner, another forgotten birthday, another lonely evening waiting beside a cold meal. It had never been about hormones. It had been about becoming invisible. 8 years earlier, Claire had been one of Boston's fastest-rising interior architects. Design magazines had featured her projects. Boutique hotels competed for her concepts. She loved transforming empty spaces into places where people felt they belonged. Then she met Ethan. Back then he wasn't famous. Whitmore Capital occupied a rented office above a coffee shop. The furniture didn't match. The computers were secondhand. Sometimes they couldn't even afford heating during winter. Claire never cared. She believed in him long before investors did. She sold her apartment, liquidated her retirement savings, worked freelance nights to help cover payroll while Ethan built the company everyone admired today. When the first major investor arrived, Ethan called her his lucky star. When the second came, he called her his partner. When success finally exploded, he stopped calling altogether. The business dinners became private meetings. The vacations became conferences. The anniversaries became networking events. Slowly, without either of them noticing, Claire disappeared from Ethan's future while remaining trapped inside his present. A movement near the entrance pulled several guests' attention away from the stage. Margaret Ellis, Claire's attorney, had arrived with a licensed process server and a retired corporate accountant who had helped authenticate the early company records. They did not enter the ballroom or interrupt the event. They waited in the hotel conference suite Claire had reserved, because neither a marriage nor a corporation could lawfully be dismantled by theater. Claire noticed the message confirming their arrival. She said nothing. Ethan never even turned around. He continued speaking into the microphone. "My wife has always been a wonderful woman." Claire almost smiled. Past tense. Always. Not as. Always. Interesting choice of words. "I believe," Ethan continued, "sometimes two people simply grow apart." His voice remained smooth, controlled, like a CEO announcing quarterly earnings, not a husband dismantling 8 years of shared memories. Claire remembered another anniversary, their first. They had celebrated with cheap takeout pizza because neither of them could afford a restaurant. Ethan had apologized over and over. One day, he'd promised he'd rent the finest ballroom in New York. One day, he'd buy her diamonds. One day, she'd never worry about money again. He had kept every promise, except the one that mattered, the promise to stay. A faint vibration came from Claire's phone. One short buzz, nothing more. She glanced at the screen hidden beneath the table. A single message. "Everything is ready." She locked the phone without replying. Outside the ballroom, no bank accounts were frozen and no executive authority vanished by magic. Instead, Margaret sent a preservation notice to the company's general counsel, delivered Claire's petition through proper channels, and requested that independent directors review records already authenticated by a forensic accountant. Decisions prepared over months were entering a lawful process that would take evidence, notice, and a vote. Inside the ballroom, however, Ethan Whitmore still believed he controlled the evening. He smiled confidently at the applauding audience, completely unaware that while he was busy ending his marriage with carefully rehearsed words, Claire had already begun ending something infinitely more valuable. His empire. That was exactly what everyone in the ballroom believed Claire Donovan was doing. The applause faded into scattered whispers. Guests leaned toward one another, careful not to be seen gossiping while doing exactly that. Reporters lowered their cameras, uncertain whether they had just witnessed the end of a marriage or the beginning of tomorrow's biggest headline. Ethan adjusted the microphone with practiced confidence. "I think it's best if Claire and I move forward separately," he announced. "We've both changed. Sometimes the kindest thing two people can do is let each other go. Kindest. The word lingered in the air like perfume that had turned sour. Claire remained seated. She could hear her own heartbeat. Steady. Measured. Months earlier, that same heartbeat had raced every time Ethan came home late. She had searched his face for affection, for guilt, for any sign that the man she married still existed beneath the expensive suits and flawless speeches. Tonight, she searched for nothing, because she had already stopped expecting anything. Ethan reached beneath the podium and picked up a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Whitmore family crest. "I've already prepared the separation agreement," he said smoothly. "I thought tonight would be the most respectful time to discuss it." A quiet gasp swept across the ballroom. Even several members of Ethan's executive team exchanged uneasy glances. Respectful? Serving divorce papers during an anniversary celebration? Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward him. For the first time that evening, she saw what ambition had truly done to the man she once loved. He no longer recognized cruelty. To him, efficiency had replaced compassion. Business had replaced marriage. Winning had replaced kindness. He genuinely believed he was behaving reasonably. One of the hotel staff approached Claire with the envelope. She accepted it politely, without opening it, without reading a single page. Instead, she placed it beside her untouched champagne glass, aligning its edges with almost unsettling precision. Then she stood. The movement was graceful despite the weight of her pregnancy. Claire adjusted a loose strand of golden hair behind her ear and looked around the ballroom. Very few knew the woman standing before them had spent countless sleepless nights designing the company's first headquarters, decorating investor lounges herself, and preparing presentations while Ethan chased opportunities across the country. History often remembered the face on magazine covers, rarely the hands that built the foundation. Claire's voice, when it finally came, was surprisingly soft. "I won't be signing anything tonight. Just one calm sentence." Ethan gave a restrained smile. "You don't have to decide immediately. I already decided." His expression stiffened. She continued, "Just not in the way you expected." Silence returned. Claire slipped her phone into her handbag and rested one hand protectively over her baby. "Our child deserves to know that dignity isn't something you negotiate across a banquet table." Several guests instinctively lowered their eyes. No one applauded. No one interrupted. The truth had a way of making even strangers uncomfortable. Then came another sound. The ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically, not violently, simply deliberately. A hotel manager stepped aside as a distinguished woman in her early 60s entered from the private conference suite. She wore a charcoal gray suit, with silver hair neatly pinned back. She carried no briefcase, no stack of files, only a slim leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She wasn't family. She wasn't media. And she certainly wasn't invited to celebrate an anniversary. Claire offered the woman a small nod. Nothing more. The woman returned it with equal restraint before walking directly toward the head table. Ethan frowned. "I believe you're in the wrong event," he said. The woman stopped exactly one chair away from him. "No, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was calm enough to chill the room. "I've arrived precisely where I was instructed." She placed the leather portfolio gently on the table, then looked Ethan directly in the eyes. "My name is Margaret Ellis." A pause. "I represent your wife's interests." The confident smile disappeared from Ethan Whitmore's face. Margaret Ellis opened the leather portfolio with slow, deliberate movements. The faint sound of paper sliding across polished wood seemed impossibly loud inside the silent ballroom. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply placed 3 sealed folders on the table. One in front of Claire, one in front of Ethan. One remained in her own hands. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration," Margaret said politely. "But my client instructed me that this was the appropriate moment." "My client." The words echoed through Ethan's mind. He laughed once. Short, dismissive. "Claire doesn't have attorneys." Margaret met his eyes without blinking. "She does now." A few reporters quietly lifted their cameras again. Something about the woman's confidence made everyone instinctively pay attention. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "I assume this is about the divorce." "No." Margaret's answer came immediately. "This has very little to do with your marriage." For the first time, Ethan's smile faltered. "What exactly are you talking about?" Margaret looked toward Claire. Claire nodded almost imperceptibly. Only then did the attorney continue. 6 months ago, Mrs. Donovan retained my firm. 6 months. The number struck Ethan harder than expected. 6 months earlier, Claire had still smiled at breakfast, still asked whether he would be home for dinner, still reminded him to take his medication before overseas flights. She had already been preparing to leave, and he had never noticed. Margaret continued speaking with the calm precision of someone reading facts rather than delivering threats. During those 6 months, we documented financial records, corporate communications, ownership histories, and several legally relevant transactions. Several executives from Whitmore Capital exchanged nervous looks. Financial records? Corporate communications? Why would a family attorney need those? Ethan's expression hardened. This is ridiculous. It isn't. Margaret gently turned one of the folders toward him. You don't need to open it yet. I don't intend to. You will. Her certainty irritated him. Claire remained silent. She wasn't enjoying this. She wasn't seeking revenge through humiliation. She simply looked finished. Finished carrying conversations alone. Finished waiting beside empty chairs. Finished believing promises that had quietly expired years ago. Margaret spoke again. Mrs. Donovan instructed me not to discuss confidential details publicly. She paused. However, she has authorized me to confirm one fact. For 8 years, Mr. Whitmore has been publicly described as the sole architect of Whitmore Capital. Another pause. The documents in this portfolio tell a different story. A murmur spread through the guests. Investors glanced toward Ethan. Board members shifted uneasily. Claire lowered her gaze. She remembered endless nights surrounded by blueprints, budgets, and handwritten business proposals spread across their tiny apartment floor. While Ethan practiced investor presentations, she built presentation models. While Ethan attended meetings, she designed offices clients would later admire. While Ethan accepted awards, she quietly returned home to prepare for another day. History had remembered only one name. Tonight, history was beginning to remember another. Ethan's voice grew colder. What exactly are you trying to prove? Margaret answered without hesitation. The truth. He laughed again, though this time fewer people laughed with him. The truth doesn't build billion-dollar companies. No, Claire finally said. Her voice was almost a whisper. But it reveals who actually helped build them. No shouting. No accusations. Just a simple sentence impossible to ignore. A hotel employee approached Margaret and quietly handed her a tablet. She glanced at the screen, then looked back at Claire. The preservation notice was acknowledged, and the independent directors have agreed to meet tomorrow morning. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second. Ethan frowned. What phase? Neither woman answered. Across Manhattan, directors received a narrowly written notice explaining that authenticated formation records and possible disclosure failures required review. No conclusion had been reached. No one had been removed. But the company was required to preserve emails, minutes, compensation records, and ownership documents until counsel could determine what the evidence meant. The process had begun hours before Ethan raised his champagne glass. Standing beneath the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by wealth, applause, and reputation, Ethan Whitmore still believed he was controlling the evening. He never imagined the game had already changed, and he had unknowingly made the first losing move. The ballroom no longer sounded like an anniversary celebration. The laughter had disappeared. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Even the musicians had lowered their instruments, unsure whether to continue playing while an empire seemed to be unraveling in front of them. Ethan Whitmore stepped away from the head table. He needed privacy, or at least the illusion of it. He dialed another number. This time, his chairman answered. Ethan. The older man's voice was unusually flat. What the hell is happening? Ethan demanded. A pause. Then 5 words. We should have listened sooner. The sentence made no sense. Listen to who? Claire. Ethan froze. Around him, no one dared interrupt. His chairman continued. 3 independent directors received documentation this afternoon. What documentation? Evidence. Evidence of what? Another pause. That your wife has been protecting this company for years. Ethan felt something cold settle into his chest. That's absurd. Is it? The chairman sighed heavily. Do you remember the acquisition in Chicago 4 years ago? Of course he remembered. It had nearly bankrupted Whitmore Capital before unexpectedly becoming one of its greatest successes. The numbers never worked, the chairman continued. We all assumed you found a miracle solution. Ethan swallowed. He had. Or at least he believed he had. The chairman spoke quietly. It wasn't you. Silence. It was Claire. The memory struck him without warning. A tiny apartment. Stacks of financial reports. Claire staying awake until 3 in the morning with a calculator, legal pads, and endless spreadsheets spread across the kitchen table. He had barely looked at her work. He had simply taken the revised proposal to investors. Everyone praised his brilliance. Claire never corrected them. The chairman continued. The restructuring plan. The hotel expansion. The sustainability proposal. The employee retention model. They all came from her. Each sentence landed like another stone. I don't believe you. You don't have to. Another pause. The board does. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. His breathing had changed. Not panic. Not yet. Something worse. Recognition. Across the ballroom, Claire quietly thanked a waitress who offered her a glass of water. Margaret Ellis approached her. The transportation is ready whenever you are. Claire nodded. Soon. She looked around the ballroom one last time. Not with bitterness. With gratitude. This place represented the end of one chapter. Nothing more. Meanwhile, Ethan walked toward her. He wasn't speaking like a CEO. He sounded like a husband searching through memories he should have valued long ago. Did you really? He couldn't finish the sentence. Claire answered anyway. Help build the company. He nodded. I did. Why didn't you tell anyone? She smiled sadly. Because I thought we were building a marriage. Not competing for credit. Not collecting applause. Building a life. She had believed that his success would become their success. Instead, it became only his. Ethan looked around the room. Executives avoided eye contact. Several investors were quietly leaving. Reporters continued filming every expression crossing his face. His perfect image was beginning to fracture. Another message appeared on his phone. Independent directors meeting, 9 a.m. Attendance requested. Below it was a second notice from General Counsel. Document preservation protocol activated. No files were to be deleted, altered, or transferred. Ethan still had access to the company portal. He still held his title. But for the first time in years, decisions concerning his conduct would be examined by people who did not report to him. He looked at Claire. Not with anger this time. With disbelief. You knew this would happen. Claire rested both hands over her unborn child. I knew actions eventually have consequences. As the ballroom lights reflected across shattered crystal still lying on the marble floor, Ethan finally understood the cruelest irony of the evening. He had spent years believing Claire needed his name to survive. Only now, when everything he built was slipping through his fingers, did he realize something far more terrifying. His greatest strength had never been standing beside him. It had been quietly standing behind him. And she had finally stepped away. The first person to leave the ballroom wasn't Claire. It was one of Whitmore Capital's largest investors. He quietly stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit without saying goodbye. Then another followed. And another. No arguments. No dramatic speeches. Only silence. The kind of silence that accompanies disappearing confidence. Ethan watched them go. Each departing guest felt like another brick being removed from the foundation beneath his feet. What are they doing? He whispered. No one answered. Because everyone already knew. People invest in certainty. The moment certainty disappears, so does loyalty. A reporter cautiously stepped closer. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any comment regarding the emergency board meeting? No. Is it true the independent directors have opened a governance review? No comment. Did your wife contribute to the creation of Whitmore Capital? Ethan looked directly into the camera. For years he had mastered every interview, every shareholder meeting, every television appearance. Tonight, words abandoned him. Claire quietly slipped on a light cream-colored coat offered by the hotel concierge. Outside, snow had begun falling over Manhattan. Small, gentle, almost peaceful. Margaret stood beside her. The car is waiting. Claire nodded but didn't move. Instead, she turned one last time toward the ballroom. She saw the crystal chandeliers, the expensive flowers, the designer gowns, everything Ethan had spent years collecting. None of it had brought him peace. She remembered another winter. 8 years earlier, she and Ethan had celebrated Christmas with a tiny artificial tree balanced on top of moving boxes because they couldn't afford furniture. They had laughed while eating frozen pizza on the floor. Back then, they owned almost nothing. Yet somehow they had everything that mattered. Success had never destroyed Ethan. Pride had. Inside the ballroom, another phone rang. Then another. Executives were no longer whispering. They were leaving. Several legal advisors were already speaking near the entrance. A board member approached Ethan. "We should leave. Counsel wants us available for tomorrow's meeting. Not until this is finished." The older man looked around the nearly empty ballroom. "The marriage announcement is finished. The corporate questions are only beginning." Those words echoed louder than any applause ever had. Ethan slowly turned. Half the guests were gone. Across the room, Claire finally began walking toward the exit. Ethan instinctively followed. "Claire." She stopped, without turning around. "I never wanted this." The sentence sounded painfully sincere, perhaps for the first time all evening. Claire closed her eyes briefly. "You didn't want consequences." She looked over her shoulder. "That's different." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because deep inside, he knew she was right. For years he had believed apologies could wait until tomorrow. That family would always remain where he left it. That love required patience only from the person receiving the pain. He had mistaken forgiveness for permanence. Claire gently touched the wedding ring resting inside her handbag. It no longer belonged on her hand, but neither did resentment belong in her heart. "I don't hate you, Ethan." The confession surprised even Margaret. Claire continued quietly. "I simply stopped abandoning myself to protect someone who had already abandoned us." Her hand rested over her unborn child. "Our baby deserves a mother who knows her own worth." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Warm light spilled across the marble floor. Margaret stepped inside first. Claire followed. Just before the doors closed, Ethan took one desperate step forward. "Can we fix this?" Claire looked at him one final time. "You had years to repair what one evening couldn't destroy." The doors slid shut. For several long seconds, Ethan stared at his own reflection in the polished metal. Behind him, the ballroom looked strangely empty. Not because people had left, because the one person who had quietly held everything together no longer stood inside it. And for the first time since becoming one of America's most celebrated billionaires, Ethan Whitmore discovered what true poverty felt like. It wasn't the loss of money. It was the loss of the only person who had loved him before he had any. 3 months later, the first cry of a newborn echoed through a quiet Boston hospital room. Claire smiled through exhausted tears as a nurse placed a healthy baby girl against her chest. Tiny fingers curled around Claire's thumb, and every board meeting, legal letter, and television argument disappeared. She named her daughter Grace, not because the previous year had been graceful, but because grace meant refusing to become cruel after cruelty had found you. Claire had authorized the hospital to tell Ethan only that mother and child were safe. She wanted no visitors until she had rested. Ethan arrived 2 hours after the birth carrying no cameras, publicist, or speech. A nurse repeated the information Claire had approved. For once, he did not demand more. He left a note at the desk. "I am relieved you are safe. I will follow whatever plan protects Grace." No excuses. The months after the ballroom had not destroyed Whitmore Capital. They had forced it to examine itself. Independent counsel reviewed formation records, early compensation files, public statements, and board minutes. The review confirmed that Claire had made substantial strategic and design contributions during the company's formative years. It also confirmed that Ethan remained the lawful controlling shareholder and that no document gave Claire ownership she had never received. The wrongdoing was not a secret transfer of the corporation. It was a public history polished until one person's work disappeared, together with documented expenses and consulting contributions that had never been properly recorded. The board required factual corrections, reimbursement of verified expenses, independent approval for major related party transactions, and a governance committee that did not report to Ethan. He stayed chief executive during a transition, but he no longer controlled questions involving his own conduct. Investors did not abandon the company in one theatrical night. Some paused commitments. Others waited for the facts. Confidence returned slowly as the company disclosed what it knew and corrected what it could prove. Claire declined every interview. Through counsel, she released one sentence. The employees of Whitmore Capital should not pay for failures that belong to its founders. She wanted the record corrected without sacrificing people who had nothing to do with her marriage. Her divorce moved with the same patience. Margaret filed a summons and complaint in New York Supreme Court, and Ethan was personally served away from cameras. Temporary agreements addressed housing, medical insurance, support, and communication about Grace. Because there was no evidence Ethan posed a safety risk, Claire did not request supervised visitation. Their lawyers arranged short daytime visits at Claire's home while Grace was an infant, with Claire or her sister nearby, until the baby became comfortable. The first visit lasted 40 minutes. Ethan arrived early carrying diapers and formula approved by Claire. When Grace cried in his arms, his confidence vanished. Claire showed him how to support the baby's head and walk slowly. He listened, returned grace when asked, and did not turn the visit into a plea for forgiveness. On the third visit, he checked his phone twice. Claire ended the visit. "She will not compete with your calendar," she said. He began to argue, saw Grace sleeping against her shoulder, and stopped. The next week he left the phone in his car. He took an infant CPR course, attended pediatric appointments when invited, and learned that consistency was not a grand gesture. It was a promise repeated when no one applauded. At night, Claire reopened boxes from her former studio, fabric samples, hand-drawn plans, and photographs of hotels she had designed before becoming known mainly as Ethan Whitmore's wife. She rented 2 rooms above a bookstore and registered Donovan Studio in her own name. Her first project was a community clinic designed to help frightened children feel safe the moment they entered. Justice, Claire realized, was not watching Ethan lose a company. The company survived. So did he. Justice was holding her daughter in one arm while signing her own drawings with the other, and never again asking permission to be visible. 1 year later, Autumn returned to Boston with streets painted gold. Grace crossed the backyard in 5 determined steps before falling into Claire's waiting arms. Their laughter drifted through the open kitchen window. It was ordinary happiness, the kind Claire had once postponed because she believed important lives were supposed to look impressive. Donovan Studio now employed 6 people and designed clinics, libraries, and family shelters. Claire praised good work, never needless sacrifice. Work mattered. Families did too. Whitmore Capital had also survived. The board published an independently reviewed history crediting Claire as a founding strategic and design contributor while accurately describing Ethan's leadership and ownership. The company reimbursed documented expenses and preserved contributions previously omitted from its public story. Ethan stepped down as chief executive after the transition and remained a non-executive director. He did not become poor. He became accountable. His relationship with Grace developed quietly. Short visits became afternoons, then one full Saturday every other week under the parenting agreement. He learned that Grace disliked peas, loved books about trains, and slept only after hearing the same 4 notes. On her first birthday, he brought wooden blocks and helped her knock down every tower he built. Claire did not confuse responsible fatherhood with reconciliation. She and Ethan exchanged schedules through a co-parenting application and used a parenting consultant for disagreements. Grace needed parents who would not use her to punish one another. One afternoon, Ethan came to Donovan's studio for a meeting Claire had agreed to. Grace drew circles on scrap paper while Claire's sister finished a call nearby. Ethan knelt and accepted a purple crayon his daughter offered him. Together they drew a crooked house with a roof too large for the walls beneath it. When Grace went downstairs for a snack, silence settled between Ethan and Claire. "You look happy," he said. "I am." He nodded. "I used to think hearing that would hurt. Now it tells me leaving was the right decision for you. I humiliated you because I wanted control over the story. I let people call me self-made when I knew better. I treated your patience as proof that you would remain no matter what I did. And while you were pregnant, I turned your vulnerability into part of a performance. Pressure did not make those choices. I did. I am sorry," he continued. "You deserved kindness from the person who promised it, and I gave you humiliation instead." "Thank you," she said. "Is forgiveness possible?" It already began. Hope crossed his face before she finished. But forgiveness is not permission to return to the life we had. It is not a promise that we will build another one together. He lowered his eyes and nodded. "I understand." Grace returned carrying 2 crackers. She gave one to each parent, then climbed onto Claire's lap as though distributing peace were the easiest task in the world. Ethan smiled through tears. At the door, he held the drawing Grace had given him. "I once thought losing control of the company was the worst consequence I could face. And now?" Claire asked. "Now I know the company was never mine alone, and our daughter is not something I possess. The only thing I control is whether I keep showing up worthy of knowing her. That evening, Claire placed her old wedding ring in a wooden box beside photographs from the years when she and Ethan had almost nothing. She did not throw it away. The past did not need to be destroyed to lose its power. It only needed to be remembered honestly. Some people believed Claire's victory was forcing a powerful man to step down. It was not. Her victory was a daughter who would grow up knowing that love did not require silence, work did not require disappearance, and forgiveness did not require surrender. The ballroom had given Claire a public ending. The quiet rooms that followed gave her something far more valuable, a life written in her own name.